Good morning. Off a day, the Committee on Culture and Justice is now called to order. Today's Monday, July 17, 2017. The time is 10:10. Notice for this public hearing were disseminated via email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets on July 10 and again on July 14, 2017. The notice was also published online in the Guam Daily Post in print on July 10, 2017. The only item on the agenda that will be heard today is Bill number 104-34 COR, introduced by Frank B. Uggan, an act to add a new Article 7 to Chapter 46 of Title 9 Guam Code Annotated, and to repeal Article 3 of Chapter 43 Title 9 Guam Code Annotated relative to establishing the Anti-Skimming Act of 2017. I'd like to thank my colleagues for attending this morning's hearing. We have Senator Frank Uggan, Senator Regine Bisco-Lee, Senator Luis Borja-Muña. Thank you all for attending today. We'll start this hearing from the sponsor of the bill, Senator Uggan. You may introduce it.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Madam Vice Speaker. Thank you for conducting the public hearing on this particular piece of legislation. Just so that the public's aware of the version that we are entertaining is Bill number 104-34 COR, as corrected by the prime sponsor, and is relative to establishing the Anti-Skimming Act of 2017. Just to know for the record and for the public's information, skimming devices are devices that can steal an individual's identity by virtue of either a credit card or a debit card. And the provision here, Madam Vice Speaker, Madam Chair, is to ensure that we update our codes so that it is prohibited. Just to share a couple of incidents that have occurred in the past, in October of last year, there were 2 Chinese nationals who were denied entry to Guam and were found in possession of a credit card reader and card skimming device. The Guam Customs and Quarantine Agency initiated their findings, and they realized that, in fact, they confirmed that these 2 individuals did have a credit card reader and a card skimming device within their possessions. And one of the statements that was relayed by the customs officer who was responsible for this particular seizure is that CQA, in quotes, CQA did not seize these items because they are not prohibited or regulated items. The mere possession of the credit card devices and credit cards is not a crime. Therefore, without admission from either of the 2 individuals, no crime was committed. One thing to also note, Madam Chair, is that in CNMI, in early April of last year, First Hawaiian Bank on Saipan also identified certain ATMs on the island believed to have been targeted in an ATM skimming incident. Also, furthermore, there were incidents that involved the Bank of Guam and CNMI, where in fact credit card readers were identified with present on the statement was the individual Park said he investigated the devices consisting of 2 green-colored card readers and 6 gray-colored plastic panels with pinhole cameras. Park said he interviewed Bank of Guam Vice President and CNMI Regional Manager Marcy Tomakani in Garapan, who told him that the card readers were an exact match with the factory-installed card readers present on Bank of Guam ATM machines. Park further said that Tomakani told him they were not expecting any service to be performed. So it tells you, Madam Speaker, that not only on island in October of last year that there were card readers as well as card skimming devices found in the possession of 2 individuals coming into our island from Hong Kong, but also not too far to the north, there were 2 separate incidents, one with First Hawaiian Bank and then also with Bank of Guam, where in fact skimming devices were identified. And this is a situation where we need to update the code on the anti-skimming, the ability to restrict individuals from bringing in either card readers or card reading devices, and ensure that there are appropriate penalties and that our law enforcement entities have the authority to be able to confiscate these particular items, to hold these individuals in possession, and allow for the judicial process to be carried out accordingly. So, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, Madam Vice Speaker, I thank you very much for having this public hearing on this measure, and I certainly hope that the legislative body will be able to entertain it soon, considering the circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Uggan. We have a couple people signed up to testify, Dr. Ron McNinch and Attorney Danny Rapadas. If you may please come on up. Dr. McNinch, you may begin.
Thank you, Speaker Terlaje and honorable senators. My name is Ron McNinch, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak today on behalf of this bill. I'm in support of certainly measures to protect our community against particularly financial transaction kinds of crimes. I'm a fraud examiner, one of the many hats that I wear. I also teach fraud examination at the University of Guam. Skimming is a emerging area of concern, and certainly having laws to protect our community against skimming is very, very important. In general, one of the most common types of low-tech skimming that I see in this community is something I would term tip puffing, which is an employee of an establishment will write in a higher tip than the person had entered, so they'll add digits or things like that. I'm not sure if this particular bill addresses that, but it's something the community should be aware of. That is, when they give a tip on a credit card, they need to be very careful about keeping track of those added charges, because an employee can easily change the numbers. In general, I like this bill. I think there's a couple of suggestions I have that are general, and I will write these in a letter to the legislature. In some ways, the penalties might be more strict in a couple of ways. First, fraud is a serial crime. People do these crimes all over the place, and they tend to move around a lot. And so it could be that a person comes to Guam and they've already been convicted once or several times in other places. So when they come here and do this crime, it's not the first time they've ever done it. And so the language might be modified a little bit to cover other jurisdictions. If they've been convicted in other jurisdictions and then they come here, it'll be a far more serious crime, because then they're a serial offender. And we need to recognize them as such. And again, there are certain kinds of crimes that are serial crimes, and fraud is one of those kinds of crimes, particularly skimming, particularly credit card fraud. One other thing that Guam might consider is basically a fraud registry for serial offenders. Many times in my practice, and I have a fairly active fraud practice here I work with either businesses or with the government, we find that the people that are doing fraudulent acts or that are kind of doing fraudulent things have done so in the past, and we've just never really kept track of them. And so they end up popping up in positions of trust over and over again. And being able to verify that a person has violated the trust, the fiduciary trust of handling money, is very, very important. And so just as we have a sex offender registry, maybe we should have or consider talking about a fraud registry, so that if a person's convicted of fraud, particularly, and I can share with you privately a number of easy-to-spot cases where this has happened. A person, if they're known as having a fraudulent background, would have never been allowed to handle money in the ways they were allowed to handle money for organizations. And it would greatly benefit our business community and our organizations that rely upon trust, particularly fiduciary trust of handling money in general. So those are my general suggestions. I do like the law, and I appreciate this very good opportunity to say a few words before you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Attorney Rapadas.
My name is Danny Rapadas. I'm the General Counsel of Bank of Guam. And the bank generally supports the intent of this law, but the bill, but we believe there are some changes that probably you need to look at. I think in some respects, Ron McNinch did point out one of our points in the memo is that the modification from a misdemeanor from a felony. And basically what we're looking at, violators are generally not from Guam. And if if the laws are modified to change the penalty for the first-time offenders to misdemeanor, violators are more likely to flee Guam than to avoid any kind of prosecution. Generally, in the court's view, when they look at the different severities, they'll see a misdemeanor and a felony, and they may look at it differently. So the different kinds of methods and ways to hold a potential fraudulent fraudster from leaving the island, it'll be tougher for the judge, I think, to hold him here. The second thing, and again, a lot of this stuff is outlined in the testimony I gave you, so I'm just trying to cut it shorter for you. The other issue is the restitution side. Although it's well-intentioned, the addition of the restitution language may limit financial institutions to recuperate its losses. Currently, 9 GCA 8050 limits the amount of restitution to a victim, which includes us, to a certain amount dependent upon the level of the crime committed. This amount may not match the financial institution's loss. Even so, the financial institution has a civil remedy to collect the remaining amounts. In a civil remedy, the banks can seek to collect any such amount in any creative ways. In a criminal statute, the collection is limited to the court's decision and how much restitution is collected. So if there's an amount there that's determined by the court and things come up later, which sometimes they do, we may be handcuffed here, or we may not even be able to pursue civil remedies because you have a person who has a restitution order, and we're not even sure if this person can even pay those restitution orders or while they're in jail or wherever they're located. So I think we may need to look at some modifications there as well. And then again, ultimately, we do support the spirit of the bill, but I think these changes that I mentioned in the memo that we've submitted would serve well, I think, in making it a little more presentable and appealable to us.
Thank you very much.
One more thing I think I did mention in the bottom line. I'm sorry about that. I understand the importance of the customs to be able to get their hands on this equipment, and that's very important. But that issue may or may not be litigated in whatever jurisdiction or wherever this is brought up. So we recommend also a severability clause in the chance that any of the areas of the laws may be deemed unconstitutional. So that may also be helpful. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to point out that the bill does amend the current, or it repeals the current law. It's intended to replace that with, you're correct, different penalties, and also additional provisions, particularly the forfeiture upon entry, that says upon entry through any ports of Guam, persons in possession of a re-encoder or scanning device may be subject to forfeiture by law enforcement officials. All right, I'm going to allow questions by the panel. Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Gentlemen, Dr. McNich and Mr. Rapadas, thank you very much for providing your testimony this morning. Just a couple of items. With regards to I appreciate the recommendation on a fraud registry and recognizing that any individual that participates in fraudulent activities on island and has a record elsewhere, certainly they would be considered serial criminals in regards to these fraudulent activities. So the only question I would have is, let's say, for example, an individual, and perhaps our attorney here, Mr. Rapadas, may be able to inject some comments. If an individual is identified to have conducted similar criminal fraudulent activities in an international community, would we have similar jurisdiction to be able to recognize that as a prior offense and then add to the criminal penalties? Because that's really where the attorneys have to come into play and just clarify whether, in fact, we would have that discretion.
Thank you, Senator. Just very, very briefly, of course, you should talk to your attorneys about that. But in general, if a person has a criminal record in the United States, in particular, there should be no question, I think, related to that.
That's correct.
But also, I think that if the prosecutor, and I think the gentleman here from the Bank of Guam made a lot of great and excellent points on this, now that I see that it used to be a felony, I think it should be a felony also from the first offense. And that's just one little point. Then the degree of the felony is really the question. And I think that the more discretion the Attorney General is given in their ability to charge these things, and that's where I'd leave it up to the lawyers to say, hey, what level and for what reason? And if a person has a history of this behavior, of course, I'm not sure whether it should matter where it happens, because they've had the history of the behavior. And in particular, Hawaii is the nearest state to us that has this problem. Hawaii has a terrible problem with criminals coming from the U.S. mainland who are serial criminals who are just there because... Yeah.
Actually, Dr. McNinch, anything that has occurred nationally, whether it's in the mainland U.S., in Hawaii, certainly in U.S. territories, that would carry over. We can certainly add to the penalties. My question is more or less from an international community perspective. Let's say someone is convicted in Hong Kong and now comes to Guam and commits a felony, in this particular case with the adjustment of the penalties. Are we able to recognize that in fact that individual had committed a similar crime in an international community, not within the U.S., because the U.S. we do have jurisdiction in terms of recognizing that. Sure. So that was really more or less my question, and that's a technical legal. Yeah,
that's an Interpol kind of criminal justice kind of question. But yeah, I think that in general it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Minich. And Ms. Attorney Rapadas, certainly the felony component. In revisiting the proposal, certainly that should remain in place. The restitution, now with the language, you're suggesting that in fact it be as broad as possible.
Yes.
So that any financial institution or any individuals that's impacted by identity theft would have that opportunity to be able to acquire restitution.
Generally, I know that when, because we've seen it in the past where the probation, they want to know how much we've recovered in the past. We share that so that they'll be offset in some form or fashion, that they're not going to have to pay more than they should have. So that's something that I believe, we have in the past worked with the probation office if there has been a fraud in the bank, so that we know that there's no over-collection.
Can you clarify the statement that you made with regards to customs and quarantine? Because, can you clarify that statement you made about customs?
Oh, no. I appreciate it. I love it, the fact that they go ahead and can take all of that skimming devices. However, that if there's a challenge a defense lawyer will probably challenge the ability for them to seize that equipment, and then that if the statute is deemed unconstitutional for whatever reason, then that portion is deemed unconstitutional. We don't want the whole statute to be deemed unconstitutional.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay, because we were looking at this as broadening the law enforcement capability.
And that's why I'm fine with it, but we just need a way to protect all the other parts just in case it's challenged.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Attorney Rapadas and Dr. Minich. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Biscoli?
Hafa gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, Dr. McNinch, maybe you might be aware of how many crimes might have been committed. I know that the author of the legislation alluded to one here on Guam where skimming devices were seized at the airport, or weren't able to be seized at the airport but weren't allowed in, and then another incident that took place in Saipan. But are you familiar with any other activity that's been going on maybe in the past 5 years or so?
Thank you, Senator. Certainly, there's two or three big factors that I think come into play here. And first, the government in the last 2 to 3 years has really made a commitment to both the accounting community and to the government for fraud examination. In fact, now the government recognizes fraud examination as a critical skill for government employees, including law enforcement. What that does is it creates awareness, it creates the ability of our law enforcement community to better enforce laws like this one. So I just want to compliment the legislature and say the legislature took a very good step to encourage government employees to enter into the field of fraud examination whether they work for government agencies or for law enforcement. The second thing is these crimes are actually, the problem with fraud is it's so invidious, it's so common that people may not even realize how frequently it occurs. Because the interesting thing about this kind of fraud, whether it's skimming or the abuse of credit cards, when you give your credit card to a supposedly trusted person and they misuse it for some reason, as with all crime, there's crimes that happen, and then there are crimes that we actually document. And in this case, there, I think, in my impression, is this type of crime in general, I'm talking about fraud in general, not skimming specifically, is very, very frequent in our community, and it's fairly unchecked. It's hard for us to keep track of it for a number of reasons, or it's not taken seriously. And I've dealt with individuals who've been really on the tip side. They end up with a $50 tip on their bill that they had no idea where it came from. And people quite often do not check their credit card bills for the amounts that they're paying. They just simply pay them. And so I think that in general, fraud is a kind of hidden crime that we simply haven't put the emphasis on to protect the community yet. And I think that laws like this will certainly get that conversation going, and the public will become more aware that they can be victims of these kinds of crimes. Because now everybody has credit cards. And now everyone on their smartphones or other things can start paying for things, which makes them much more susceptible to skimming, because they don't realize that their information can be electronically stolen from them and then used. And so people are unaware of it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's currently a third-degree felony to anyone who might take this kind of action, but do you think that the proposed imprisonment and the proposed fines within this bill are satisfactory to address these crimes?
For me, and I think that, and we love to talk about throwing the book at criminals, but from my standpoint, and this is the key thing that I'm concerned about, is we end up seeing the same people doing these things over and over and over again. And I have no idea, and especially when we hire people over and over again to handle money who shouldn't be handling money. And that's even low-tech fraud. That's just letting people handle ATM transactions for your company. And so those are I think that, how do you deal with a person who violates the trust of almost every company they've ever worked for, and quite often these companies are embarrassed to do anything about it because it makes them look, like they have internal problems, and so they don't want to tell people. They don't want to report it as crime. And so being aware of people who've done these kinds of things is part of the riddle. But I do believe that as time goes on, what I'm afraid of, just as I'm afraid of Guam one day becoming a haven for sex offenders because people want to come here under the registry, and luckily we have a federal law that protects us against that now. I'm afraid, as the Bank of Guam kind of implied in its statement, that we're going to become a haven for people who do these kinds of crimes because our laws aren't strong enough. And so I think having a strong law, having a strong system that is constitutional, that meets all the thresholds required, is important. And so certainly, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McNinton. Yeah, I certainly am in support of this legislation for those very reasons, and I applaud the author. And I also really want to thank you both for participating in this hearing and just giving us a broader perspective. Attorney Rapadas, in your statement, these kinds of statements are really helpful for us, and I think just noting that you're in support of the intended purpose of the bill and you outline some instances and ways to make it stronger. I think just going to Dr. McNinton's point, you write that violators are not typically from Guam, and if the law is modified to change the penalty for the first-time offenders to a misdemeanor, then violators are more able to flee Guam and avoid prosecution. So I think just taking those into account will be helpful for the committee going forward and improving the bill. So thank you both so much, Ms. Massey. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much. Senator Moore?
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker. Also, I support this legislation. I remember the story when this broke out about the two Chinese nationals, and it created a very big anxiety for me now walking up to an ATM. So I just have a couple of questions for Mr. Rapadas. First of all, your ATM, the machines, are they equipped with like I guess alarm systems? If someone touches it or alters it, does it sound off an alarm? Just curious.
Yeah, the ATM machines they're called anti-skimming devices are installed in the machine, so that if there's any kind of jiggling, because generally it takes less than 5 minutes to place these machines. It's very quickly. It's done quickly, and it's usually done at 2 or 3 in the morning. So if there's any kind of there's areas there that are sensitive, that if there's any kind of, how do we say, movement or insertion or anything of that nature, then it will send an alarm through the our information security side or the ATM side to say, quickly check this ATM.
Okay. Also, I know that there's some new technology where people can actually use their phone now rather than an actual card.
Yes.
How would the consumer be protected too if, say, for example, their phone was stolen and they have access to any information on their phone? Is there...
Well, generally, if you have a good, like the iPhones and the Androids, there's a lot of security embedded in the machines, in the phones, and if you follow the protocols of your phone and your safekeeping and all of your a very tough password, then you should be protected.
Okay.
Because a lot of the information in there it should be encrypted.
Obviously, I haven't involved myself in that type of technology yet, so I was just curious. I wanted to ask that question. This question is for Dr. McNinch. Thank you very much for bringing up the fraud registry. Now, I know Guam doesn't have one, but the Federal Bureau of Investigation does have a fraud registry, don't they?
I'm not sure, but I do believe that these database kinds of enforcement techniques are very useful to law enforcement, particularly when you have known people doing known things. And when we're talking about serial crime, they've really revolutionized serial crime in the United States, having lists, or particularly, a person's behavior has indicated that potentially in the future they'll do the same behaviors. And so fraud in particular, it might be useful to consider it or even discuss it. I think that there have been other registries for other types of crimes in the United States also, other than sex offender registries. So there are other kinds of criminal lists. And so this might be one for consideration. And again, and out of the meeting, I'll certainly give you examples. I have plenty of local examples. I'm not talking about a registry for people who are off island. I'm talking about local examples of people who should not be handling money and who have been hired over and over again because for a number of reasons. And so a registry might help. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't have any more questions.
Thank you. The article that described the customs and quarantine case here on Guam said that Customs CQA did not seize these items because they are not prohibited or regulated items. The mere possession of the devices is not a crime. And so this bill in 46.703C would say that it makes a crime, Part C, possess a scanning device or re-encoder with the intent to use the scanning device. So it still includes this intent with possession, except for the part, which I think you were referring to, Mr. Rapadas, that says on 46.705D, those who are entering Guam's ports, right, in possession of a re-encoder or scanning device may be subject to forfeiture. Now, they wouldn't be subject to the the other penalties, perhaps just forfeiture of those items, according to this bill. So I guess I want to clarify if either of you have any comment on whether the possession of a scanning device or re-encoder should be a crime with or without the intent, I guess.
The internet allows very easy access for everything you need to duplicate a debit or credit card. The issue of intent, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, just merely having it, is it a crime? As a banker, I'd probably say yes, but if I was a defense attorney, I'd probably have all kinds of other issues relative to that. But, I mean, to me, I see no other reason for you to have that equipment unless you want to use it for bad intentions. That's how I see it. Yeah.
Dr. Medich, did you have any comment on that?
Yes, thank you. The only non-bad intention I think a person would have for these devices is if, other than a bank or a financial institution which has a specific reason for having them, would be places that train people how to use these devices, including law enforcement who have internal training for how to recognize these things. But if we can regulate fireworks, we can regulate devices like this. I don't see really the key distinction. There's no productive purpose a person would have probably for these devices in a community other than the training part, or if they're a legitimate financial institution that requires them or a business that requires them. I would not see. So I think that the question is, why would a person have these devices otherwise? And I think that's an excellent question. If we don't let people have fireworks, we shouldn't let people have things that are damaging, or potentially damaging, like these devices floating around in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Section 46.705 under miscellaneous provisions creates an exemption. So Part C says that this article shall not apply, and then it lists two exemptions. And I guess I want to know, particularly from the banks, whether this is enough. It doesn't actually list law enforcement. It says the exemptions are those who possess these devices in the ordinary course of his or her business or employment and pursuant to a financial transaction entered into with an authorized user of a payment card who has given permission. If you have any other suggestions regarding this exemption language, then I would ask you to please submit it to the committee.
Okay, I can have my staff just look at it and go from there.
Okay, thanks. And one more question I have is, in the same article that talked about customs not being able to do anything for mere possession, it also cites a Saipan incident. It says, in May, a Chinese national was arrested by the FBI on Saipan after U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers confiscated skimming devices from his luggage. The person was charged with illegal possession of device-making equipment. I was just wondering if there's the parts of these things are device-making equipment versus the devices, because the bill strictly defines the devices. I mean, do you have any comment on extending it to device-making equipment? I was going to look up the federal law. I haven't yet, but to see if they define device-making equipment versus just the devices themselves. Yes, Dr. McNitt.
Thank you, Madam Vice Speaker. I think the broader the definition, the better, because it should really be the Attorney General who should have discretion on these. And I think that emulating the federal law, because federal law in most jurisdictions in the United States, customs is handled by the federal government, and having mirrored customs laws or mirrored federal-like statutes, particularly for criminal items, I think is a good policy. But in general, I think the the more tools the Attorney General would have, the better, in my view, from a law enforcement perspective.
You never know what they're going to come up with out there, so the broader the better. So I see it.
All right, and back to the penalties. So the author has indicated that he would like to see the felony nature of this remain in the statute. And then the restitution, do you think, I guess in your testimony, Mr. Rapadas, you're saying that the way the restitution is written in this bill might impede a bank's ability to recover or to go after a person civilly?
Right.
Can you be more specific? Do you think we should, first of all, who's the victim as described in this bill? Would that be the bank?
It would be the bank.
Okay. So what specific changes? Do you think we should not have any restitution, or do you think we should just also allow for additional?
I think restitution is fine, but also just, I guess it's that dollar amount that's sort of curious to us, because we don't know sometimes after, if we find the equipment on there already, we don't exactly know how much has actually been taken from us, and that may not be found out till like 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now. Yes, we may catch the individuals after or when they've installed it, and they may have already transmitted the stuff on the internet, and generally this information is not created immediately. That's what we've seen. They would hold it, sell it out there in the dark web, and it may come up 6 months from now, 7 months, even a year from now. That's when the information might be used. So keeping some kind of open amount, or the ability for us to make whole, would be helpful. Although probably it may not be possible, especially if they're not from Guam or if they're foreigners. We understand that. But if it's somebody local, then at least we have some kind of ability to be made whole.
Okay. Well, under penalties, it lists fines. So there are fines, yes, criminal fines, and then Part D says, in addition to the penalties, a person convicted shall be ordered to make full restitution to the victim. Is this the part then that you want changed? Part D?
Yeah, because we don't know. I mean, at that point in time, maybe the order at that point can be debated about what is full restitution. I don't know, but it might be a good idea to just somehow keep it a little more broader, because again, if there's anybody that's going to be damaged, which is us, we may not know until a year after it's been committed.
What about if we included language that says nothing herein shall limit
the bank's ability to collect? That's fine. Something to that effect would work.
All right. Okay. I want to thank you again for your testimony, and I would allow the sponsor to have any additional questions or.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, to yourself and our fellow colleagues who brought up some issues and concerns, thank you so much for highlighting them. Just for the information of the public and also a number of us in the room, if you take a look at Section 46705, miscellaneous provisions, it refers to any scanning device or re-encoder. Then that would fall into the opportunity for law enforcement officials to be able to seize or destroy these particular items. But when the suggestion was to broaden the language, if you take a look at sub-item B, it says any computer system, computer network, or any software or data owned by the defendant which is used in the commission of any of these activities, which continues on, which is used as a repository for the storage of software or data illegally obtained in violation of this section. So it broadens the application to not only a particular encoder, anti-skimming device, but any and all. It's more or less inclusive, and that language was intentionally incorporated in there to ensure that we cover some of the broader possibilities out there. Finally, I want to just highlight that there are some businesses that use encoders and re-encoders, legitimate businesses, for their operation, and that's why it highlights the exemption. So we need to be able to recognize that there are a number of businesses out there that certainly utilize that, and the intent is to ensure that these legitimate businesses continue to operate without being negatively affected, but then any individual that has the intent or would fall into this particular category of trying to illegally obtain someone's identity as well as their resources or money certainly would be captured by this particular proposal, and that they'll be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. So it's all about identity theft, trying to serve as a preventive mechanism, but also empowering our law enforcement entities so that they would have a law on their side that they can immediately confiscate these items and then allow for the Attorney General's office or the Guam Police Department to carry out their respective responsibilities. So I just wanted to highlight those particular provisions in the proposal. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to my colleagues for being here on this panel and for your questions. And thank you again, Dr. McNinch and Attorney Rapadas, for your very helpful testimony and helping us to really protect the people of Guam from this type of crime. There being no additional individuals to present further testimony, this committee will continue to remain open until July 31, 2017 for the acceptance of any additional information or public testimony on the agenda items. You may submit testimonies to my office directly here at the Guam Congress Building, the mailroom of the Guam Legislature, or through email at senatorterlajeguam@gmail.com. The public hearing is now adjourned. The time is 10:49. Thank you very much.